Welcome everyone, my name is Kiel Peterson and today I'll be doing a book review for my MBA class, OPTM 6590, Project Estimation and Risk with Warren Schubert. The book I chose to read and do a review on was Project Manager's Spotlight on Risk Management by Kim Heldman, PMP. I found the book to be a very interesting read and easy to follow. It's written in first-person narrative format. It provides a lot of examples, real-world examples to relate to the material, to understand the process and why it's followed a certain way. The examples range from something as simple as hosting a wine party and treating that as a project, to extensive photo shoots around the world, all the way to major software projects or construction projects. The book is specifically targeted for project managers that are, I believe, relatively young and new, because it's focusing on small projects, small to medium projects, I suppose. And for that, it doesn't dive into some of the more detailed information that we've learned throughout our semester so far, but it's a solid handbook because it provides some templates and quick references to make sure that you're staying on track when you're following these processes. The introduction is a good overview of what the book is going to cover, but it also goes further to include a refresher on the 9 project management knowledge areas, something I wasn't specifically familiar with in my experience, so it had that in the appendix and recommends it as a quick review before you dive in. I found that to be very useful because it kind of put the whole information and some of the references that the book was talking about into context before diving into the material. So with that, I think we'll dive into Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is titled, What is Risk Management? And it goes through defining the risk management process, which is, I found, particularly useful for people who are not familiar with risk management in their small to medium projects, which is what this book is targeting primarily. It starts with the 5 main areas, which is identifying and documenting risks, analyzing and prioritizing those risks. For the ones that are serious enough, you develop risk response plans. In the event that you need to implement those plans, you would need to monitor and control those risk response plans. And then in the end, you'd have a risk review audit, which is similar to the lessons learned aspect of most projects, in a continuous improvement essence, to be able to capture information that might be useful for future projects. I found it also particularly interesting that this book dove into the fact that risks are defined, I guess, by the likelihood or the probability and the impact or consequence. We use those terms interchangeably, but those 2 components, the likelihood and impact, is what I'll use to be consistent with the book. That's consistent with the same readings that we've been going throughout the semester. And the part that I found particularly interesting is that this book describes how the likelihood of a risk actually decreases as the project moves forward, because you're going through that process of progressive elaboration. You're defining the scope a bit more, and the likelihood of risk occurring generally decreases. Impacts, on the other hand, generally increase as the project progresses, because if a risk does crop up late in the execution phases rather than the planning phases, it might cause a lot more need for rework or changes, which could push the project over budget or behind schedule, rather than if you had identified that risk and mitigated it in the planning phases, it might have not even had any consequence on the project. So when it's getting into descriptions like that, it provided very good examples of how such situations or such risks might present themselves in common examples. And then it actually dives into something that the Project Management Institute has called the Project Management Book of Knowledge, and specifically the 6 knowledge areas for risk management, which are risk management planning, risk identification, qualitative risk analysis, quantitative risk analysis, risk response planning, and risk monitoring and control. So with those in mind, it's very similar to the process I described before, but each of these gets discussed further in the following chapters. At the end of this chapter, the very first one from the 6 knowledge areas is risk management planning. So at the end of this chapter, before it dives into further identification of the risks, the first thing to do is lay out the risk management plan. Now, this was something I was not familiar with specifically in my role in my current job, but with this chapter, it actually goes through the methodology, roles and responsibilities, the budget that you might need for performing these risk activities, reporting formats, and then for the qualitative and quantitative analysis, you can actually define the rating scales, and going through things of that nature. It actually provides a template which is very useful for people like myself who haven't found or haven't experienced risk management planning before. Gives a great starting point so that they can dive right in, and I think for the target audience it's trying to hit, it did this part perfectly. So with that, we'll dive into Chapter 2, Identifying and Documenting Risks. So for Chapter 2, when we're identifying and documenting risks, this chapter dives in to discussing the type of materials you need before getting right into identifying the risks. First, what it's asking you to gather is the historical information from past projects that might be relevant and useful for this project, the work breakdown structure, and the scope statement, both of which have been developed for the project by this point. So the next step is to develop the categories and subcategories for identifying risks that you're going to use throughout the course of the project. Ideally, these will not change throughout the project, just to keep things structured and stable in that regard. This part of the book actually provides a comprehensive list ranging from simple to catastrophic risk categories. Very, very long list, and provides the reader with a lot of possible ideas for how to structure the risk documentation. And from there, it also points out that for this step, once you've set those categories, they should be set in stone ideally. And every time that you're going through a risk review process from here on out and throughout each of the phases, that these categories will remain rigid, but the rest of the processes from here on out should be done iteratively to make sure that you're managing risk effectively. Once you've established those categories, it talks about where to look for risks, how to look for risks, and how to document the risks. So first, with the where to look, we've already spoken about the project information from past projects, work breakdown structure, scope statement, but it also dives into the assumptions and constraint analysis that may have been conducted. If not, it actually goes through how this can be conducted to bring up some of the assumptions that were made throughout the risk management or risk planning process and the general project planning process, to see what assumptions may or may not have been valid, same with the constraints, to try to bring some of those risks to light. Once you've had all of this information available, it goes about how you're going to identify those risks, and it's basically going through who to talk to, the project sponsor, the project champion, other project managers who've worked on similar projects, but it also dives into saying how you should consider talking to your team members, not just consider how you should talk to your team members, because they may have better experience or more broad experience on tasks similar to this nature and may have better insight into the risks than yourself and others. From there, it dives into some really useful things where you can actually, aside from just having off-the-cuff water cooler discussions or just general status meetings, it actually gives you the structure of using interviews, the Delphi technique, brainstorming sessions, nominal group technique, so that people aren't talking to each other and you don't have dominating personalities taking over. All the pros and cons of each of these different techniques are discussed so that you can pick one that would fit your environment the best. From there, it actually dives into documenting the risk and how you should, the best practices, I suppose, for how these risks should be documented in terms of numbering, a solid description, it's naming, I guess, first, and then a solid description, and then it sets up the structure for the qualitative and possibly quantitative aspects of the analysis as well. Chapter 3 is titled Why Projects Fail, More Risks and How to Prevent Them. I found this chapter to be a little bit out of place at first because it was made up about 20% of the entire book, and it seemed like we were going through the process of defining the risk management process, developing a risk management plan, and identifying things, and we'd be moving into analyzing and prioritizing. But instead, we take this little sidebar off to go through risks and responsibilities, authority and responsibility in project management. And it to me, it seemed like we were sidestepping and getting a little bit off track, but once I got into it, I realized it was very appropriate, because at this point in the project, you've gone through your scope statement and your work breakdown structure and your risk management plan. Before diving into the actual heart of the matters, you need to make sure that the roles and responsibilities are laid out for the project, not just for the project purposes, but also the risk management processes. So with that, it kind of discusses the PMINO syndrome. It's an acronym, Project Manager in Name Only, and some of the reasons why that can cause a project to fail. Mainly because the syndrome is discussing projects or project managers that actually have no authority or accountability to perform the tasks they've been handed, and the problems that can precipitate from that. One of the best ways to combat something like this is to develop a RACI, which is an acronym for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. It's basically a table that lays out the different roles and who's responsible for what. You would have the different tasks for the project on one side, and then going across the top you have each of the positions, say the project sponsor, project manager, the champion, and the team members, and kind of lay out who's responsible for what so that it's clearly defined from the start. That's one of the best ways to make sure that everything is clear right from the get-go, so people understand where they stand in the project. If some of these processes and some of these approaches aren't taken, it can lead to something like disengaged teams and other reasons for failure, but particularly disengaged teams was talked about a fair bit and stood out to me a little bit because I've been part of teams like that in the past, and I found that it actually gives you some good detail as to why these come about, that you get into that situation with disengaged teams, and how you can prevent it in the future as a project manager, primarily by defining these roles and responsibilities, but also if you find yourself in that situation, how you can go ahead and turn it around and make sure that you can still finish this project successfully. From there, it actually dives into the three main organizational structures for projects, and kind of ranging from one end of the spectrum that's functional, where everything is kind of a hierarchy, and all of the say all the accountants report to an accountant, chief accountant, and all the engineers are in a group, that kind of thing, to the other end of the spectrum where everything's project based and you have all the different functions, accounting, HR, engineering, IT, everything that you need for that project is available and fully dedicated to that project. And then right in between is the matrix organization, which is a blend between the two, where you have your resources reporting, I guess primarily living in a functional role, and then they're temporarily assigned to project tasks as suited for their abilities. This goes through, this is something that most project managers I think are familiar with, and it goes through kind of the pros and cons of each one of them, the advantages of each, and how you can make sure that for any type of structure you can make sure that those roles and responsibilities are defined. And it goes through, say, for a project manager that's working in a matrix or functional organization, that they can make sure they have some sort of leverage over the team members that are being seconded to their project, to make sure that they show that they have the influence to either, affect their performance review in a positive or negative way, to make sure that they can get that engaged team that will successfully complete a project rather. At the end, it also touches on consultants and how consultants primarily are concerned with making money, so they're making a profit for their consulting services. So whether they're a technical lead or they're actually brought in to be part of a leader on a project, rather than a technical expert, that since they don't necessarily have the best interests of the company in mind, they should always be reporting to a project manager, or at least to a project sponsor who maintains clear lines of communication with the project manager to make sure that that relationship is managed appropriately. So with that, this book carries on with the project risk management process from here. Chapter 4 is about preventing scope and scheduling risks. The first half of the chapter discusses scope risk specifically, and how a project is broken down from the goals into deliverables and then the requirements, with the goals being the main purpose of the project and why it was initiated in the first place. The deliverables are the key things that need to be produced in order to achieve the goals of the project, and then the requirements are the kind of the specifications or the attributes of the deliverables in order to make sure they serve their purpose. So the author is stating that the main source of scope risk specifically comes from the deliverable and requirements sections there. They make an interesting point that when going through kind of the scope definition part of the project, that when you're defining the deliverables and the requirements, that as you're listing each of these, you should also take the time to list the advantages and the reasoning why the certain deliverables were chosen and why those requirements and specifications were chosen as well. The idea is that in the future, if a change had come up, that this would provide the justification of why it was originally picked that way, so that you can compare to what the new proposed change is and kind of weigh them and kind of use it as a defense to make sure that scope creep isn't occurring unnecessarily and that changes that are made are valid. And it's as a way of managing risk. It actually goes into a risk management process as well and the advantages of having one, and talks a little bit about it, but it doesn't really dive into it. It just more or less passes it off to another book in the Spotlight series, which I found a little bit frustrating because I thought they could have dove a little bit more into detail on it. But they made the point, I guess, that having a change management process is necessary to prevent scope risk, but again, it was a little lackluster in that regard. From there, it discusses scheduling risks, and from there, excuse me, it discusses how scheduling risks can crop up, but it also dives into how the project tasks should be estimated in terms of duration, and it touches on the PERT technique, the program estimation review technique, so that where you use kind of a most likely, an optimistic, and a pessimistic estimate of time, and then use a calculation to estimate your times in that regard to kind of keep things realistic. But then also, while you're using that technique, you're using your team members and their expertise and kind of the clear communications with them to be able to make sure that you're getting accurate estimates to minimize that risk. The other thing that I'm particularly a big fan of critical path analysis myself, and it does touch on it a little bit, but again, it passes the buck to another book in the Spotlight series, and rather than getting too far into it in this book or in this chapter. And I found that again a little frustrating. It's talking about the risks and the importance of dealing with them, and then when you're talking about how best to deal with them, it kind of just gives it a brief overview and then carries on. So I found that a little bit frustrating, but I guess these books are easy enough to read and affordable, I guess, that you could purchase the other book to get that information in that regard. Again, it touches on a change management process at the end, and how you can use it for a scheduling technique as well, or means of managing schedule risk. Again, the project, or it discusses that the change management documentation should have formal approvals, a written statement of like describing the proposed change and why it's necessary compared to the existing path that was already decided upon. And this way it kind of formalizes it and should be able to weed out any of the scheduling or scope risks that would crop up just because people want to add enhancements rather than creating valid changes that would add value to the project. So with that, at the end it has a case study that shows a project manager is working on an IT related project, again in that small to medium size, so it's easy to relate to. And it uses some of the techniques that were discussed throughout this chapter to kind of give an idea to the reader of how you would go about implementing some of these practices to kind of protect your project from scope and scheduling risks to make sure that it remains successful. Chapter 5 discusses analyzing and prioritizing risks, both from the qualitative and quantitative standpoints. So being an engineer, this is my bread and butter, this is what I particularly enjoy. Again, they're talking about what materials you need, your past project information, work breakdown structure, all of the documentation in that regard. And then again, quickly and briefly reviews the impact and likelihood that you'd be assigned to for each of the risks, whether you decide to just stick with qualitative, if that's all that's necessary for your project, or if you want to take it to the quantitative level, depending on the severity or potential for severity of impact to your project and what your company's risk appetite is. So starting with the qualitative risk analysis, if it wasn't already done so in the original risk management plan at the start of the book, if you haven't already, or start of the project rather, if you haven't already defined your risk rating scales for the qualitative sections, this is where you would do it first. You need to define the ordinal values, your low, medium, and high for both impact and probability, you need to assign kind of what the thresholds of each of those is defined by, so that when you're going to grab your risk register and try to assign a probability and a impact to each one, you kind of know where it falls in the scale, because you've defined it right at the start. Once you've defined each of those for each risk, your impact and probability, you're kind of just putting it together into a risk score that is a qualitative word combination. So if it was high impact, low probability, it'd be high low. It could be low high or medium medium, however combination there. So that once you have all those risk scores tallied up, you can prioritize them. So obviously the high would be the critical ones that need response plans. Low lows would be definitely negligible, but then the gray area kind of comes in where you need to define if a medium high requires a risk response plan, but maybe a low high doesn't. So you're kind of getting into that little bit of a gray area, which requires team discussion. And the book goes into this detail on the types of techniques you can use for qualitative or quantitative risk analysis and prioritization. So it kind of dives into those, the brainstorming, interviewing, the nominal group technique, the Delphi method. It even goes so far as to say the SWOT analysis, which is typically used at an organizational level. You could try to apply that for these risks as well, because it's kind of getting into those opportunities and threats as well, strengths, weaknesses. From there, it dives into the quantitative risk analysis portion, where now, instead of defining the scales in terms of low, medium, or high, you can identify them in a range of numbers from 0 to 1. So now you have a little bit more granularity, and you can apply the values. You can even use, I guess a little more detail in that regard, but once you assign the likelihood and the impact, you simply multiply the two numbers to get your risk score that's a numeric value. Now that you've gone through your entire risk register and signed these values, you have your risk score. It's easy to just sort it largest to smallest to prioritize, but you still need to kind of draw a line in the sand for what is critical, what is significant, and what is negligible. So the author recommends that you define those right when you're defining your risk rating, that you actually take those range of numbers and define kind of the blocks that are going to be converted back into negligible, critical, and significant, so that you can develop your risk response plans accordingly. From there, it discusses briefly sensitivity analysis, decision tree analysis, and other like Monte Carlo simulation techniques, but it does this in very limited detail. Gives a very, very brief overview and shows some pictures, but I was a little disappointed in this because the topics are very useful for larger projects, or projects that have the risks or impacts of negative consequences on those projects, or that project failing might have a serious impact on the company overall. So while this book is targeting small to medium projects and project managers for those, I still thought it would have been useful to dive into it a bit more. It does reference, again, a Spotlight series book that can be referenced for getting in a bit more detail on those topics, but I thought it would still be useful to dive into it a bit more, so that the project managers at this level could actually start implementing them a little bit and getting some practice with them before you would actually be taking on a large project and doing these techniques for the first time. So that was just one of my thoughts on that one. Once you've actually completed either the qualitative or quantitative analysis, however far you need it to go. Qualitative is kind of what you always start with, and then you take it to quantitative for kind of getting a refinement of some of the larger risks at the end. If you once you have all of those analysis completed and you've finished prioritizing things, you're ready to move on to the next chapter, which discusses risk response plans. Chapter 6 is defining the risk response plans in regard to what the risks that you identified and analyzed in the previous sections. So once you've ranked those risks and decided which ones are critical and which ones are significant, and depending on your risk appetite for the company, you've determined which ones are going to require response plans. You now are going to take a look at which approach would be best for dealing or handling with the risks. So the author goes through and presents 6 different approaches First one is avoidance, then transference, mitigation, acceptance, contingency planning, and lastly the one I hadn't heard of before is independent verification and validation. So now 4 of these are proactive approaches, things you're going to take to try to reduce either the impact or the likelihood of a risk before it happens, and 2 of them are reactive and just kind of dealing with the aftermath if the risk does actually materialize. So the first one that it goes through is avoidance. Basically you can either avoid the risk altogether by planning around it or just avoid the cause of the risk. Throughout the book, throughout this chapter, the author is providing excellent examples and entertaining examples of how these strategies could be applied to a simple international photo shoot where you have to travel from one place to another kind of thing, getting the equipment there, what could crop up, and how you would apply these risk response plans in the event that you needed to from a reactive approach or the proactive approach. From the proactive ones, that actually, for avoidance where you're just avoiding the cause altogether, transference is where you're getting insurance to basically cover the loss and you'd be making payments to the insurance company in order for them to accept the risk. You'd mitigate it, which is the most common one, which is basically just trying to take whatever measure you can to reduce the likelihood or impact of the risk. And then the independent verification and validation is hiring a consultant to basically audit your risk identification and analysis and prioritization techniques to make sure that you're kind of on track and you're developing appropriate response plans. All of those proactive ones, they're given in light that you should be comparing the cost of the consequence. If that risk actually materializes, you should compare the cost of that impact to what the cost is to mitigate it ahead of time. If the cost of avoiding or transferring or mitigating or hiring an external consultant is greater than the risk itself, you should not be doing a proactive approach. The idea is that you would be fine with either contingency planning or just straight up accepting the risk, and then if it happens, you would just deal with it as best as you can. The contingency planning approach is that you'd be specifically setting aside resources, whether it's money or human resources, to complete a task, given that if a risk materializes. So it kind of goes through each of these. As I said, it gives excellent examples, relatable examples, but one of the things I found interesting is that I always kind of took the approach that if you actually developed it or argued for a contingency, for a risk management plan, that was one of your risk responses, to have a contingency plan. The author is actually suggesting that you make sure that if you need to use it, you definitely use it. Some project managers, myself included, would try to avoid using the contingency at all costs because it looks like, hey, I managed the project so efficiently that I didn't need this contingency. But really what it could look like is that any project has a risk associated. There's always risks associated with it, and risks are inherently uncertain. So if you assign a contingency to it, then and you're never using it, it might actually look like you're kind of bolstering up your basic estimates, so you don't ever need to use your contingency. You actually might be more trouble. So it's kind of a interesting approach that way, an interesting insight, and I found it good to see that when they're trying to represent general project management knowledge, that using contingency is actually encouraged. So found that quite interesting. Chapter 7 is implementing and monitoring risk response plans. I found this chapter the title to be a little bit misleading, because really it's an extension of the last chapter, where it seems like it finishes off some of the topics from that chapter, and then moves into the actual implementation phase of it and the monitoring. Basically, when you're developing your risk response plans, it's suggesting that you actually assign a risk owner, typically a team member, or it could be the project manager as well, to monitor the situation of the risk and see if, be on the lookout for risk triggers. A risk trigger, the analogy that's provided in the book, is similar to thunder. If you hear thunder in the distance, it's kind of a trigger that lightning storm might be coming your way. So in some cases, some risks may have triggers that you can't actually identify, some may not. But a risk owner ideally would be trying to keep a finger on the pulse to see if any of those triggers are coming, to signal that the risk might materialize, and then in the event that a risk does actually occur or turn into a consequence, that the risk owner would be the one responsible for implementing the risk response plan. The thing again that should have been developed in the last chapter is that the risk response plan isn't just, hey, make sure your insurance company knows about it kind of thing. It actually goes into detail that you should have a step-by-step guide that said, say, okay, this risk has occurred. If there's chaos that ensues, you want to be able to have that plan laid out step by step so that the risk owner can execute swiftly to make sure that the projects can stay on track or has as minimal impact as possible. From there it gets into what I would say the title is more apt to discuss, is that the risk reviews for the identifying these triggers should be done periodically, whether it's at status meetings or have separate meetings with just the risk management team if that doesn't constitute the whole team. Just the author provides ways and formats for conducting these reviews and kind of going through the plans and also reviewing what you have identified as risks and which ones have kind of fallen off and which ones have kind of become more important, and maybe making new risk response strategies as needed in that regard. It kind of gives you some of the format for that, which I found to be very useful and insightful. It has a little touch at the end of, if you've actually had some project or risks that have occurred that are damaging and catastrophic to the project, that you need to know when to cut your losses and actually recommend that you kill a project. I thought that was interesting because I think, myself included, I think a lot of people would have difficulty recommending that you stop working on a project and just bail on it when an entire team's been working on it for however long. But if that is really the best decision, project managers need to be able to make that decision or recommendation to their sponsors. And I thought that was actually a very valuable piece to add. Lastly, at the end, it talks about the risk audit, which is similar to the lessons learned aspect of a typical project management cycle, where you actually go through and review, just in regards to the risk management process, how effective the identification process was, the analysis and prioritization, how well your risk response planning went, and how well your implementation of those risk response plans went, if they were needed. And then main thing is to know what was done well and what was done poorly, so you can improve upon it for the next time. So again, that whole continuous improvement essence is what's incorporated here. So that's it for the book review. Overall, I found the book to be a very interesting read and entertaining read. It was actually a pretty easy read as well. I found that it was very well suited for the target audience, being project managers for small and medium-sized projects. Again, I was a little disappointed that it didn't go into detail on some of the topics. It just kind of said, please refer to our other books in the Spotlight series. But it was understandable, and since the books are rather short and easy to read, it was less than 200 pages, it would be easy to pick up those other books and use them as appropriate. So it was pretty good specifically for the risk management process. And overall, I think I was able to learn some good tips and tricks in that way, and something that's a little bit different from the stuff we've learned so far in the course, but mostly in line with what we've seen this semester. Overall, I enjoyed the read. I hope you enjoyed this review as much as I enjoyed making it, and I would also welcome any feedback. Thank you.